Well, good morning, everybody. I have been staring at the screen for quite a while this morning, just trying to make sense of it. I think the best way to sum it up here this morning is just to say that I don't like it. If you look at the kind of precipitation activity on the radar loop, valid kind of in the overnight here to this morning, is it's disorganized. There's kind of bubbling convection anywhere from South Texas through the southeast over to Georgia up through Kentucky. You can even see some convective showers moving through in the overnight through central New York, through the Great Lakes over to Nebraska and Kansas. If I asked you or myself, where is the low pressure system? Where is the organization to this pattern? I couldn't answer it, right? It's not clear. And it looks summer-like, which, would be fine if it was late July, early August, maybe at times in June, but it's late April, right? We're really more in the planting window, not in, your typical summer week or calendar month right now. So it clearly indicates there is a lack of flow, a lack of momentum in the atmosphere. And I think what we have to figure out critically is, while this might be at large decent for finishing up our planting window here, is it's concerning going into May and into June. If this pattern or this behavior in the atmosphere were to hold, we'd have much bigger issues. I think another way we can kind of sum up this behavior is if you just look over the last 24 hours of precipitation across the continental U.S., you can kind of notice that it's splotchy, right? There's these areas of focus. We had actually some severe thunderstorms try to work through central Iowa yesterday with some warnings all the way through the southeast. We had thunderstorm activity, more significant severe weather in terms of wind and hail through portions of the Texas Panhandle up into Kansas as well. But again, it's splotchy. It's kind of indicative of this kind of rogue nature to some of these storms. They're just kind of folding around different areas of the country. We're going to see more of that today. And then if we compare this to, a more typical spring-like April pattern that I would be expecting in a given kind of mid to late April week, you'd have to go back to maybe an early April map of this, which would be a 24-hour preset from earlier in the year where you clearly had organization. You obviously had a low-pressure system moving through here. The storms moving along that with these identifiable swaths, right, quickly moving, in some direction, right? But if you just jump back and look at this last 24 hours, it's hard to even tell which way the storms were moving. Maybe Iowa, right, a little bit closer to that momentum, which is really kind of retreated up into Canada. You can see some of these likely moving this way, but otherwise it's just not clear, right? Another way we can kind of compare this, if we look in early April at the jet stream, well, we clearly had momentum out of the Pacific coming through Texas up into the central U.S. This was the large severe thunderstorm outbreak that we had across the Mississippi River Valley. I'm going to compare that jet stream here in early April to what we're seeing here this morning, right, April 24th. And again, there's just this lack of momentum, lack of flow in the atmosphere. Now, critically, we do have this kind of weak flow all over the southern continental divide that is helping to organize some of the severe thunderstorms and that dry line much further to the west over into the southern plains. And that has been good for organizing precipitation chances there. But in terms of bringing storm systems through the whole country, while we might get some of these thunderstorms here moving through today and tomorrow, we'll talk about that. Longer term, longer range of the forecast, getting out into early May as we inch closer towards summer, this kind of broad lack of momentum in the flow is concerning. It's not a reliable producer of precip long term. And that's really what we're after here is figuring out where this pattern's headed. Now, I think part of the maybe issue here is that we have left La Niña officially. That happened earlier this month in April from the Climate Prediction Center. But in looking at the sea surface temperature anomalies here this morning, which is valid as of this week, I'll update this here. No change yet. You can see some cooler waters here over the Central Pacific. We talked about the cold waters off the Baja. Eric just mentioned yesterday this kind of trade wind surge that has brought cooler waters to the Eastern Pacific. Now, while we're certainly not in El Nino and we're not still in a La Nina, there is still a La Nina-like kind of behavior, I think, out of the Pacific and then certainly in the atmosphere reflecting that lack of momentum as well. And this is maybe better viewed by, instead of looking at these sea surface temperature anomalies, which is going to compare those ocean temperatures to how they have looked historically in the past. That's one comparison. But another way we can do this is just comparing them to how they look against the global mean, the current mean temperature of those sea surface temperatures. And when we do that, it paints a different picture. We can clearly see more relatively cooler water across the Central Pacific, all the way through the Eastern Pacific near Peru, stretching across through Tahiti, along the equator here, and then stretching south of the Baja. Even, right, you could almost connect this up to the Gulf of Alaska. And this kind of pattern here with relatively cool water here is what we look for when we're looking to lose momentum in the atmosphere in summer. It's a classic kind of correlated with drought signal in the central U.S. that we look for every single year. So I think there's still a connection here to this fading La Nina, and that's why that fading La Nina signature shows up in some of those drought years, and it's prompting this drought conversation this year. I think another way to kind of look at this lack of momentum, we're looking on this map up here, a lot going on in this chart, but really we're looking at the whole globe from the South Pole to the North Pole, up and down on this chart. That's what that is. So really where we are in North America kind of focused on the weather is in this part of the graph. And in this part of the graph, it's going back in time. So this is the current day, and that's going from right to left back in time. You can actually see the months here. So February, March, April, and then here's where we're at today. And the colors on here are shading that momentum in the atmosphere, essentially trying to highlight where the jet stream has been stronger than average or weaker than average over this area here where we're focused on. Now, to start out the year, we had a lack of momentum, at least in the southern portions of our area and then the jet stream. But we picked that up as we went into the end of February and then into March. We lost that sort of lack of momentum or relative lack of momentum as we went through March and into early April. We had a lot of interesting weather to talk about here at the end of February all the way to the beginning of April. But we've noticed that in the last few weeks, we've started to pick up some of this, concerning relative lack of momentum just in the last week or two. And we're starting to see that in the forecast. We're seeing that in the atmosphere with the thunderstorms that we just talked about. And kind of curiously looking at this, lack of momentum in the atmosphere going through spring into summer is a kind of a hallmark of La Nina that we look for. And when we started to pick up the momentum here in the mid-latitudes at the end of February, we weren't kind of persisting just to the south of that, this relative minimum. We were all the while weakening La Nina. So those sea surface temperatures in the Central Pacific we were just looking at, here's January 30th through March and then April, right? La Nina was weakening very quickly to the point where by early April, the Climate Prediction Center said that La Nina was officially over. But since then, we haven't, increased the temperatures of those waters in the Central Pacific. Now, we haven't decreased them back into La Nina. I thought about that for a little bit, but at the very least, we've kind of plateaued down here. And I think that's also a little bit indicative of what we're seeing here with this lack of momentum coming up and rearing its head. Now, these tend to have kind of a seasonal cadence to them. And what I mean by that, Eric touched on this yesterday, that that chart, that global wind oscillation, rotated around like this. And so there's this chance here, and my hope is that, this lack of momentum kind of works itself through the atmosphere. Sometimes it moves polewardly like that. And then by late June, July, we're switching into a different pattern. The problem with that, which I'll explain at the end, is summer kind of behaves in its own way in North America. You lose that kind of spring predictability of trends moving on and then magnifying and then moving off. That's kind of what I just described in sort of that hopeful fashion. But that doesn't always hold true in the middle of summer, June, July, August in North America. And when it doesn't, right, we can see those more concerning drought years. Now, what does this mean for the immediate forecast for the rest of this week and then early May? Well, it means more of this. This is just the Storm Prediction Center's severe reports as of yesterday. It's not organized. There's not terribly too many of them, which is good news. If we look over into the West Texas, the Panhandle, up into the Oklahoma Panhandle, West Texas, or I should say Kansas, hail reports, some of those more significant, some wind reports down in the Panhandle as well. I'm surprised this hasn't been filled in a bit more. I thought we had a bit more storm coverage. We'll take a look at that in just a second here. But again, expecting more of this activity kind of in the same area. We'll look at that in just a second here. If we look at the jet stream level winds valid here as of this morning, again, there is some flow. It's weak. We're in late April. It's hard to just totally shut off the flow across North America, but it's disorganized, right? There's not a coherent trough or big ridge pattern to talk about across the central part of the country. It's just kind of this general disorganized jet stream level flow. Now, if we look to the west of that, we do have a more obvious trough moving into California, and that's going to bring in some interesting weather that we'll have to talk about going into very early next week, Sunday, Monday, and Tuesday. But in the meantime, we're just kind of dealing with this diffuse flow positioned across the continental divide here that's going to bring more storms today, tomorrow, and then into the weekend. Now, this lack of momentum as it continues into early May, right? We're seeing this in the forecast. We'll talk about this in the end. Relatively dry across the central part of the country. This is decent planting window. This is the 8 to 14 day precipitation outlook, May 2nd through May 8th. And again, while windows will be wide open here, I always get a little bit concerned giving a good planting forecast, right? Because as nice as that can be in May or maybe mid-May, right? If that conversation persists into late May, early June, suddenly we're talking about a whole different sort of conversation. Now, there's the saying about, planting into dust, the bins will bust, and perhaps there's some truth to that. But if I'm making that forecast, I'm kind of hoping it's coming through in mid to late April, not necessarily early or mid-May. So we'll talk about that too near the end of this video. Now, another good news here is if you're kind of tired of these spring cold weather chances, that as the jet stream has retracted up into Canada, it has allowed this kind of broad warmth to move into the central part of the country. And that's expected to continue. We don't see any signal of a significant freeze or frost into portions of the Midwest or the Eastern Ohio River Valley here as we get into May, let alone through this weekend. This is the day 10 to 15 average from the ECMWF ensemble, and it's just broad warmth across much of the country. Now, you might be asking, kind of eye-catching down here, what's happening in West Texas, northern Mexico, maybe even getting up into the panhandle of Oklahoma, Kansas. Well, that's because out to the day 10 to 15, we're still getting some flow underneath this broad ridge, and that is good news for the southern plains. We'll talk about that too in just a second here, but this cold weather here, so to speak, is underneath storms, right? Clouds, precipitation, evaporative cooling, that's going to help bring those temperatures down in the long range. Another thing we're seeing is Europe trending dry as well. This is the 14 days, so 0 to 14-day precipitation departures from average April 24th all the way out through May 8th, again from the ECMWF ensemble. And with that lack of momentum, Europe is feeling that as well. Eastern Europe, Ukraine, drier. Some pockets moisture in here, but really central, almost over into Western Europe, British Isles as well, leaning drier with this trough more positioned off of the coast of Western Europe here. Same thing, this lack of momentum. Another way that we can view it just global, if we look out May 2nd through May 7th, the ECMWF ensemble, ridge over the central U.S., ridge off the coast of North America, that trough we talked about off the coast of Western Europe, trough here in the Gulf of Alaska. I don't like that look in early May. That could stir up the waters, upwell some cool waters in the area we don't necessarily want to see trending toward colder water as it correlates with drought in the central U.S., and then a ridge in the Western Pacific. That's kind of your triple ridge pattern. Now, it's early May, right? We don't want to see this, but it's early May. There's time to get out of this pattern. My concern is, again, as you go through summer, right, you can less rely on this spring consistency to change the pattern that we're in every 7 to 14 days. We are more liable to get stuck into one regime as we get into June and then into July. I do want to point out, if we look over at the panhandles just yesterday, this is the satellite valid as of yesterday. There's that dry line in the panhandle of Texas, but look at the storms firing along that dry line. Always cool to see that every single May. A lot of storm chasers out here, pictures of large hail. You can even see some of the gravity waves moving there overnight in the infrared satellite imagery. But I'm going to take this back for a second. I want to point out, you may have seen that on the first playthrough. There's actually a dust storm that picks up along the outflow boundary of these thunderstorms here in West Texas. You see that moving through southeastern New Mexico. Love seeing that. You can even see it in the overnight in the infrared satellite imagery as relatively cooler temperatures. That's what those outflow boundaries are. So just always fascinating to see that. I would expect a very similar kind of display here from satellite today with some of these thunderstorms moving through the panhandle of Texas. And remember, this is an area that needs some excess moisture. I don't know if they need it in the form of hail and high wind reports, but if we just look at those overnight radar animations, just neat to see those thunderstorms percolate through West Texas, now pushing into Central Texas. And again, that kind of, right, there's different names for this, kind of the popcorn or air mass thunderstorms, you'll sometimes hear them called, because it just kind of lights up like a Christmas tree. Again, we expect that in summer. That's a pattern I typically think of in late May, June, even July and August. So seeing it in late April, again, it catches my eye, certainly. Again, just quickly checking on the last 24 hours of precipitation, had some decent rains here in West Kansas, some areas that needed it here into Texas. It is a bit sparse though, so right, it's not like everybody's getting an inch of rain all at once. It's a little bit better coverage here over the southeast. Some of these storms still kind of percolating into the upper Midwest here today. I did want to play the forecast forward. This is the HER forecast. It's a high resolution and allows us to get the simulated radar forecast going forward. I'm going to make this valid. Let me update it just to make sure I'm on the latest forecast that we can get to here. I'm going to update this as of 7 a.m. I'm recording this about 6 a.m. Central Time. So you can see some of those lingering thunderstorms in Texas over Kansas and Missouri here. I'm going to play this forward. Those are likely to weaken here this morning. Now, the color bar, I have to say on here, makes these storms look a bit stronger than they are. So, this almost looks like a disaster for, Wichita Falls or something. But this is really probably weakening thunderstorms at this point. Some percolating thunderstorms here over in eastern Tennessee, South Texas. Take the, the color bar with a grain of salt here. But as we get into this afternoon, right, we see again that kind of broad scattered thunderstorm activity. This is expected to be largely sub-severe. Can't rule out, some very small hail in some of these, and then some lingering showers and storms up here in Iowa, portions of Dakota, Minnesota today. You can see Wyoming seeing some of those showers. But it's really by this evening, 6, 7, 8 p.m. Central Time, we're expecting additional supercell development in the Texas Panhandle, Oklahoma, western Kansas, maybe even portions of Colorado here. And then again, moving through southwest Texas as well. You can see those thunderstorms picking up into the overnight. And then tomorrow, let's get into Friday. Finally, these thunderstorms, this activity starts to push itself further east. So over the Midwest, Illinois, Indiana, Ohio. See the Tennessee and Ohio river valleys all the way down through the southeast, even getting over portions of western PA. This is Friday at lunchtime. This forecast stops there. But what it does point out is that what was kind of bubbling here is starting to push off to the east on Friday with decent rain chances spreading across the eastern Cornbelt. So this week we've been warmer, trying to climb up into the 80s here in a lot of locations, and soils have been drying out from the weekend precipitation. Again, another day of work likely if we can get into the fields here. That could persist into maybe very early tomorrow morning, but likely precipitation chances picking up pretty quickly here, either overnight tonight into tomorrow morning or midday tomorrow. If we look at the SPC, their outlook, this is valid for today. You can see very similar area that we talked about with the radar animation yesterday. So eastern Colorado, west Texas, portions of western Oklahoma and Kansas. Day 2, smaller area, but look at the gray. This is that, I mentioned this earlier this week, the thunderstorm contour, where the storm predictions highlights that thunderstorms are possible in this entire corridor tomorrow on Friday, and that's as this very weak low pressure system starts to exit toward the east. I say weak because we could hardly identify a storm system just a second ago. If we look at the day 3 outlook, this takes us out to Saturday. We're starting to see a cold front push through the south here as that low pressure system moves off to the east, leaves a cold front behind that, and that actually pushes the storms all the way up into eastern New Mexico. So we could see that dry line that we talked about all the way over toward the Continental Divide. That is good news for folks wanting precipitation here if we can avoid the bigger hail and some of the wind reports. Now, if I just take the precipitation totals, this is from the ECMWF forecast. I take this all the way through Sunday morning. So it takes us through Saturday, I should say Friday into Saturday, and then Sunday morning. You can see decent precipitation amounts as the storm system, this very weak one, moves toward the east. Portions of Nebraska, Iowa, some areas here easily getting up over an inch underneath some of the stronger thunderstorms, but a much broader area here looking anywhere from about 1/10 to 1/2 inch. You can see some areas maybe near Chicago missing out, but I wouldn't put too much stake into any one of these rain holes or shadows, if you will. Again, this map will not look exactly like this when all is said and done Sunday morning, but decent chances in here for precip as we go through the next 3 days, potentially quelling some of the field work that I know is picking up pretty quickly. Now, that only took us out through the weekend here. I want to play this forecast forward. This is from the ECMWF looking at precip. This will take us all the way out through next week. Now, we talked about that trough positioned off the west coast that was moving into California. That is a bit more of a coherent, organized system. So at least as we get through this weekend and then into early next week, that gives us some more typical spring-like weather. We'll have a low pressure system to talk about, potentially some more defined severe weather risks. But as you'll see when I get to the end of the forecast, it kind of folds right back into this pattern that we're kind of seeing this week. So I'll talk about that as I get to it. Let's take the forecast here through this afternoon. You can see widespread thunderstorm activity expected across the southern and central plains. We talked about that from the HER forecast, and then continuing that kind of air mass or random thunderstorm activity over the southeast, and some of the showers and potential storms over Iowa, southern Minnesota today. As we go through tomorrow morning, that activity, there's that low pressure system finally identifiable. It is, not a deep low pressure system at all, but it's enough to organize these storms and get them moving east. So we see by Friday afternoon, rain chances picking up across the central and eastern Corn Belt, through the Tennessee valleys, even into portions of the Carolinas. That moving east as we get into Saturday morning, with that cold front pushing south, now pushing those thunderstorms on Saturday further off into the Texas Panhandle, maybe even eastern New Mexico. And then I've talked about this for a while. A lot of this activity missing Florida, which is starting to stack up some of these consecutive dry days here. It's much easier to push drought into an area like Florida that's used to more persistent rainfall than it is for areas of the central U.S. So we get into Sunday now. That trough's really kind of positioning itself like this over the western U.S., and that's starting to organize this flow out of the Gulf back up into the central United States. That continues on Sunday with with much warmer weather. As on Sunday, you'll notice behind this cold front, as we start to flip the winds around out of the south, out of the Gulf of Mexico, by Monday morning and then Monday afternoon, organizing showers and thunderstorms well up into the north woods of Wisconsin, central Minnesota. There's some question on Monday as to how far south some of this severe activity actually organizes, maybe into Iowa. Could see some of storms pushing back toward western Missouri. And then in the overnight, those pushing further east through portions of Wisconsin, central Wisconsin, eastern Iowa, perhaps again unzipping down the front over here into eastern Kansas, northern Illinois. Weakening overnight into Tuesday morning, potentially by Tuesday afternoon and evening, storms reorganizing on this front that's now positioned all the way from New York to Texas. Some of these could be severe, kind of right in this pocket here where some of the moisture meets the better flow out of the west. So tracking a potential severe thunderstorm situation on Monday and then Tuesday in the areas here. It's a bit far north, so that Gulf moisture has a long way to go. So there's some questions as to how significant this could be, but it's something to watch as we go through the weekend here. Now, I touched on this briefly, but we haven't actually looked at those temperature values. So this is starting here as of Thursday morning, looking at the maximum temperature forecast here from the NDFD. You can see finally here, 80s overspreading a large area. I've been asked by a lot of folks in this area, when are we finally going to crack that 80-degree Fahrenheit temperature? We're doing it here in a lot of these locations, even up into Michigan. Can't even rule out upstate New York at this point here on Thursday. But you can see the influence of that cold front now over the northern plains. So take this in through Friday. You can almost see the location of the low pressure system as it's starting to push east with that warm weather. Still here over the Midwest and eastern Cornbelt, but the upper Midwest and the central plains, that cold front making its presence felt. More wholesale, that's the situation on Saturday. We talked about those storms being pushed up against the Continental Divide. But then Sunday, that flow flips back around, that low pressure system, that trough now being felt over California. You can see 80s now reaching across the Midwest, upper Midwest, and the central plains. And then by Tuesday, again, you can kind of see where that low pressure system might be pulling that warm air up, starting to bring a cold front back around. And then that's why we talked about those severe storms kind of right in here, but generally staying on the warmer side through the 10 to 15-day forecast. I do want to jump back quickly, take this ECMWF precipitation forecast to Friday. Let's do Friday at lunchtime. As this trough kind of makes its way in over the western U.S. on Monday and Tuesday, bringing the severe weather that we talked about here. On Friday, it's actually got to make its way into California first. So we're seeing some kind of anomalous rainfall pick up in late April. It's April 26th now. As we get onto Saturday, see some central coastal showers here for California, maybe even some of these getting into the Central Valley. Could even see some snow in the Sierra Nevadas as this works its way through on late Friday into Saturday morning, and then lingering all the way into potentially Sunday morning here, even some of this rainfall getting into the Intermountain West, Snake River Valley, and then over into Nevada as well. A little bit anomalous as we get into late April. It tends to be when the West shuts off the precipitation. We aren't typically talking about Sierra Nevada snow at this time. So again, just kind of curious weather going on this week. It's something to watch for. We'll continue to look at it. As that storm system moves through the upper Midwest, the northern plains on Tuesday, and then works through the Midwest on Wednesday, bringing in some decent precipitation to the Dakotas, Minnesota, all the way over here into eastern Montana and Wyoming. Now, if you remember, this is an area we were talking about in spring that had a lack of snowpack and snowfall last winter. So they're still needing some of that deeper soil moisture profile to improve. And I think they're getting that here as we go through Monday, Tuesday. And it's not going to totally nix drought issues going into the summer, but this precipitation is significant. So as much as I talked about the early May momentum concerns, getting this precipitation out in the central U.S. over into the eastern Corn Belt, it's not a ton. It's not going to just delete those drought concerns, but it is helpful. As I take the forecast in, this is now Friday next week. I'm taking it all the way out there very quickly because this is the jet stream forecast. I'll move back. Let's do this quickly. Let's go back to Monday and Tuesday. There is that trough that's responsible for the storm system on Tuesday. So take the forecast out to Friday. We see another one of these troughs here late week, potentially bringing temperatures down in the eastern Corn Belt for the Northeast. But this dominant ridge returns quickly to North America late next week. Again, this is early May, all the way getting out into the first week. And let's just take the forecast all the way out here. Again, that jet stream retreated well up into North America here. Now, we do see this cutoff low. I mentioned sometimes when these ridges are so dominant, they allow flow to sneak in underneath, and that would be very good news for portions of the southern plains and the southwest, certainly the southern high plains. I know they're getting a lot of activity this week, but really the worst kind of drought and the drought monitor right now is anchored across this area here. And if you bring a cutoff low here in May and you park it over, Cabo or Arizona, maybe even New Mexico, you're just going to light this place up with thunderstorms. We see it in May when that happens. If we look at the 8 to 14 day outlook from the Climate Prediction Center, we see that pattern unfolding. We see that drier pattern now over the Midwest and the upper Midwest. And again, while it's good news here, I think good news for portions of the Southeast, the eastern U.S., we just had a big wildfire in the last 48 hours in the pines down in southern New Jersey. We'll take a look at that in just a second. We talked about Florida, right? Keeping some of this flow underneath the ridge is not bad news for some of the areas in drought here, and more localized over here. But the concern is it's decent planting weather in the Midwest. If we keep this lack of momentum going into summer, we're going to have some larger concerns. Again, jumping over and looking at that drought monitor, this will actually be updated as of today, but certainly we won't see a large update to the southwest. We might see some improvements here over Texas, portions of the Central Plains. But the worst drought anchored over the southwest, we're expecting precip in that 8 to 14 day window if we can get some flow underneath, which appears likely at this point. Talked about the upper Midwest, some of the lack of snowpack here, some concerns here. So adding that potential inch of rain on Monday and Tuesday as the system comes through is important for some of these areas here, again, to quell some of that drought concern, which I just raised right at the beginning of this video, looking at the lack of momentum. And then we talked about Florida and New Jersey. There's been this kind of localized dryness this year. I mentioned, kind of the NASCAR anomaly this year with some nice race weather this year. Speaking of which, Talladega on Sunday seems to kind of miss. So as the storm system comes through Friday, lingering on Saturday as well, that activity finally starts to wane on Sunday. So I think, decent chances that that activity quells enough on Sunday to continue that streak. And you can kind of see even over into New Jersey, some of these localized areas here, we've had rain, right? We're not in kind of extreme or exceptional drought. There's been rainfall events here, but if you just add them up through the year, they haven't been enough year to date. And we just saw a major wildfire in the pines in southern New Jersey. Let's see if I can get that to play. There we go. You can see that loop here, that hot spot showing up, unfortunately, very clearly on satellite, and the smoke streaming off the Atlantic coast. Eric touched on this yesterday, but as we look out into the long-range forecast from the ECMWF, these are the come out weekly, the extended forecast. This is looking out May 1st, so kind of the beginning of that renewed dry period that I talked about for the Midwest in early May, taking it all the way out to June 1st. We see that continuation of dryness. You can almost see the pattern that I'm concerned about unfolding here with momentum to the north, similar to what we're seeing in early May. Some flow getting underneath, right? Maybe some precipitation getting into the east, hopefully Florida, maybe the southwest, but largely across the central part of the country. If this pattern holds through the end of May into June, the problem becomes if we dry out these soils here in the central U.S., along the continental divide, or maybe even the Midwest, right? It almost works to prevent this trend from reversing itself because it allows heat to build into the central part of the country. Then we have the solstice in late June, so we'll have plenty of sunshine baking this area for the entire month of June. So if we pick up precipitation and soil moisture deficits in the month of May, then we go into a hot June, it's going to anchor a ridge over the central U.S. It's what's going to happen. It's what the North America can do, and it does it in odd years here every now and then. Now, the question would then become, are we going to get precipitation into July to break it? And that's its own conversation that we'll have to have then. But we are at least setting the card deck up early here in the planting window for significant drought concern. But you might be able to guess it. Like, I've been doing this only about 7 to 10 years in terms of really trying to piece together the seasonal forecast in summer. I can at least say it's early, but in late April, this is significant of a drought concern that I've had heading into the beginning of the growing season. Now, that's not me forecasting any sort of large disastrous drought, but it is saying that there are enough alarm bells beeping here to highlight that concern. There are ways out of it. The precipitation that's coming in through the central part of the country and the upper Midwest and the northern plains are quelling it to some degree. But seeing the lack of momentum that we currently have in April, seeing how peculiar that is, it's something to watch, and it's significant, and we'll have to see where we go in May and June. Thanks for watching here today. If you got through the end of the video, I'll be back with you all next week. Eric will talk with you all tomorrow morning.